Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to contribute to this Applied Energy Symposium at MIT again. So today I will talk about decarbonization of the European energy system. I'll present quantitative scenario studies we have developed in the Open Entrance project, a European project. My name is Hans Auer. I'm with Vienna University of Technology. And here on the slide, you see the main contributing authors and affiliations of this project, among others. So how to understand our scenarios? Details can be found on the link openentrance.eu and also the qualitative, the narrative descriptions of the storylines behind. So the possible developments of the European energy and transport system up to 2050. So we have developed 4 narratives, and based on them, so we have quantified the scenarios I will present in this presentation. These low carbon scenarios, they comply with the European fraction of the 1.5 or the 2 degree global warming targets, depending on the scenario. Therefore, it was necessary to calculate the remaining CO2 budget for Europe in our modeling exercises. We have used the integrated assessment model message IX Globium and quantified the remaining CO2 budget for Europe to completely decarbonize the energy and transport system. So the main determining parameters are the technology portfolios and the availability of different technologies, also the possible breakthrough of new technologies like carbon capture and storage, floating offshore wind turbines, and so on. And then, of course, one of the key parameters is the exchange rate of the energy technologies, the switch from the fossils to clean technologies. And this is mainly driven by the CO2 price development, so determining the different trade-offs. So our quantified scenarios, on the one hand, of course, they show the necessities of the optimization model to find a feasible solution in our analytical approach. And on the other hand, so in real life, in policy making and industry implementation, they show us the needs, what needs to be done in the European energy system if we seriously intend to phase out from the fossils and comply to the global warming targets. So at present, this could, let's say, not considered to be feasible, or even our imagination from the past would not, let's say, trust this kind of results I will present now in the next 30 minutes or so, because it will see technology exchange rates which need to be implemented very, very fast. And also in terms of financeability of this technology change. So this is really ambitious, and therefore, let's say, our kind of thinking from the past might not be sufficient anymore. So therefore, we also intentionally have not used the business as usual terminology again, but we implemented also possible disruptions in the different scenarios. And what I present here, so the energy system model Genesis mod, and also the data behind, so they are available and offered fully open source and open access on the platform. And with this kind of tools now and in the future, also everybody on this globe, so third parties, can play this piano and develop the model and the functionalities further according to the individual needs, and of course conduct those studies with the corresponding empirical data sets of the system boundaries of interest for further studies for third parties. So here we see the concept of our three-dimensional storyline approach. So the narrative descriptions of possible future developments of the European energy system. So we have defined three drivers in the three dimensions, which finally, let's say, shape possible future energy systems. It's on the one hand technology, and in this context, the breakthrough of new technologies and the novelties. On the other hand, society, so the smartness of the society in the future, so the public attitude willing to adapt and to actively push this energy transition. And the third dimension is policy efforts and policy exertion. Within this three-dimensional space, with this cube, we have defined four storylines. So we have three exposed storylines complying to the 1.5 degree target. So this is in yellow techno-friendly, in blue societal commitment, and in green directed transition. And a little bit a more conservative story is the gradual development. So it's in the origin of the coordinates. This complies to the 2 degree scenarios and a little bit less ambitious decarbonization of the energy and transport system. And each of the, let's say, three exposed storylines always considers 2 out of the 3 drivers, finally determining the narratives. So for instance, Technofriendly assumes that we have breakthrough of key novel technologies like carbon capture and storage and large-scale rollout, or floating offshore wind turbines and so on. And society, let's say, supports the large-scale implementation and rollout, and also the use of the corresponding economies of scale and annual utilization of these large-scale technologies. On the other hand, societal commitment assumes that there won't be a significant breakthrough of new technologies. We have to rely on existing ones. It's a rather decentralized approach with a lot of local market clearings, with a lot of PV systems being integrated, and this is also supported by strong, let's say, policy incentives to accelerate implementation of these kind of decentralized energy systems. And for instance, directed transition describes a story where we have, on the one hand, a breakthrough of novel technologies, but rather a reluctant society, and therefore a policy push will further, let's say, support the rollout of these technologies. So details can be found on the project website, on the link in the corresponding deliverable 7.1. So here on the flowchart, we see the entire modeling approach, how we determine these European scenario studies, on the one hand on aggregated European level. So this is what I present today, the green area. At present, we are also working on results on country level to break it down to the individual countries, and also how things fit together. So in blue on the upper left, we see the storylines and how this fits into the entire modeling exercise. It's very important. We had an initial status quo of the Genesis mod energy system model. This is a successor of the previous osmosis modeling approach. And we have further developed it, tailor-made according to our needs, and extended it. And then finally, of course, the empirical scaling was also aligned to existing work, to, for instance, the input parameters and the fossil fuel prices, also related to the world energy outlook in Europe, the primes studies to be comparable. And it also, then our scenario studies have been validated, of course, with also the message model with the existing global pathway database, that the most alike pathways have been used, and then the validation has been conducted accordingly. And this flowchart shows further detail, which are not of interest for us right now, but how results have been delivered to the open database and to the platform, and how they are further processed also for country-specific studies and technology-specific use cases and case studies. So here we see the Genesis mod energy system model. It's already available, fully available on the platform and on GitHub of the European Energy and Transport System. On the left, we see the initial state, and on the right-hand side, so the status quo, and based on the right-hand side on this granularity and setup, the quantitative results are derived, which I present right now. So here we see just a few highlights about the improvements and adaptations for our tailor-made studies. So initially we had 17 regions, now we have 30 plus regions in Europe, more or less on country level. So the Western Balkan region is still aggregated, but our colleagues are working on that. Then in terms of functionalities, the initial time slices, they were replaced by reduced hourly resolution and a time clustering algorithm in order to come up to results within a feasible, let's say, time of simulation. And many empirical data sets have been further disaggregated, are more granular, mainly also in the industry sector. And we also added a functionality from the initial CO2 budget constraint only, also to be able to model exogenous carbon prices. And we have used both CO2 policy instruments in the analysis, for example, for the directed transition, which really needs a strong policy steering into of the three exposed storylines. We have implemented the CO2 budget constraint in the model, in the optimization model, and then finally the shadow variable determines the shadow price, which is, let's say, the CO2 price signal, which is needed and drives the trade-off and the exchange rate of the technologies. And in the remaining three scenarios, we have used the CO2 price as an exogenous parameter. So now I present a few highlights of the four quantitative scenarios. I will start with the societal commitment. So as we said, societal commitment is rather the decentralized European energy future, which could occur. So nobody knows. So there is no preference. So in our kind of analysis, so several of the four different stories could become reality in the future. And the corresponding quantitative scenario studies. And so here in societal commitment, we assume this decentralized approach with strong support of policies accelerating the process. So on the left-hand side, we see that the primary energy will decrease to 50% or below 50% compared to the status quo. That will decarbonize the fossils, and in orange we see still gas, but also gas will be phased out until 2045 in terms of primary energy fuels. So in this scenario we also assumed two additional aspects. On the one hand, a completely phase out of nuclear power in Europe. So our model builds hardly any new generation capacities or nuclear capacities, and here we used it in addition as a constraint to see what would happen if we really would anticipate a complete phase out of nuclear. And on the other hand, we assume that there is no carbon removal technologies available on large scale, so that we cannot, let's say, emit any CO2 emissions in 2045 and 50 anymore, because we simply have no technology which could neutralize this development. So this we see on the right hand side, and this means that we need let's say have to implement strong efforts to decarbonize not only the building sector, but also the industry sector, and then of course until 2040 also the transport sector. So it's very, very ambitious what we see here. So next we see for this societal commitment scenario on the left hand side the electricity generation. So electricity generation will double until 2050. So we see a strong electrification of the energy system in general, but we'll see it for also the remaining scenarios in general. So this electrification is apparent everywhere. But here in societal commitment, so on the one hand we see this strong, let's say, development and significant implementation of this yellow color. This is PV, photovoltaics, both utility scale implementations and also local building integrated PV based on local market clearings. And on the other hand, we see strong onshore and offshore wind in blue-gray. So on the one hand, the light and the darker color on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we already see it on country level, the corresponding electricity generation in 2050. So we have preliminary results on country level, but we are still working to improve the country-specific downscaling in Europe. But this also is then finally a part of our exercise to deliver everything on country level. So next we see for this scenario on the left hand side the residential sector. In orange again we see gas, which will be phased out gradually, and finally in the longer term in 2040 to 2050 we have strong implementation of heat pumps, so air sourced and ground sourced, and bioenergies and a little bit solar. On the right hand side we see the industry sector, where we also phase out from gas, and we will have a strong electrification of the industry sector. So this is the yellow color on the left hand side, what we see here, and we have to completely phase out from the fossils in this scenario. We'll see then another one in the techno-friendly, where the industry sector can still, let's say, implement certain amounts of fossils in 2040, 2050, if we have, for instance, CCS technologies. And here on the societal commitment, we see the transport sector on the left-hand side, passenger transport, which relies heavily on electric vehicles, and on the right-hand side we see the combination of electric vehicles, and in the freight transport, of course, in the heavy duty transport. So we also have to rely on hydrogen. So the next one, as indicated, is the techno-friendly scenario. I show two slides here. So again, on the left-hand side, electricity generation until 2050. We also see, let's say, that electricity generation will double in Europe compared to the status quo due to the strong electrification of the total energy system. And here we see, let's say, a little bit less PV penetration compared to societal commitment. So it's rather, let's say, still a centralized approach, replacing from the existing energy system the fossils with, let's say, renewables with high utilization hours. And here on the left-hand side, we see the strong, let's say, deployment of offshore wind, because here we also assumed floating offshore wind turbines already delivering a significant amount of electricity, also used for instance, for hydrogen production, and delivering to other sectors and end uses in the industry and also in the transport sector. And on the right-hand side, you see the corresponding emissions, and due to the availability of CO2 removal technologies like CCS, we also can have a certain amount of CO2 emissions in up to 2050, and we still can comply to our climate targets. This can be seen here in our settings, so the quantitative numbers on the left-hand side, so what's finally compensated on CO2 emissions. On the right-hand side, again, you see the industry sector. In orange, you see the gas. We rather phase out from gas, but to a certain amount, we can still rely on a few other fossils in the industry sector, because we simply, let's say, can neutralize the CO2 emissions with for instance, CCS technologies available in this scenario. So the directed transition is this scenario where we have strong policy steering, where strong national policies in Europe are considered and taken into account. And one interesting aspect is here that, for instance, in nuclear, so this is on the left hand side, the color, so it's wine red. So on the one hand, assumes lifetime extensions for nuclear power plant fleet. So this is what we already observed in, let's say, recent months and last 1 or 2 years in a few countries, so like France, that this decision already was taken. There is also in a few countries like Poland, they consider to phase in into nuclear, or in Slovenia to build an additional block to an already existing power plant. So this already takes into account, on the one hand, these kind of policies, and of course, to a certain extent, but not too much, but to a small amount, also a repowering of a few nuclear power plants are decided also by the model. But in general, they are not necessarily competitive in the cost minimization approach. And on the right, on the left-hand side, you see the primary energy development here, and on the right-hand side, the corresponding electricity generation, where we see, for instance, this nuclear aspect. And on the other hand, of course, the directed transition is rather the onshore wind deployment is even more pronounced compared to the offshore deployment in the directed in the techno-friendly scenario. And for instance, in the techno-friendly scenario, the offshore wind deployment is assumed to be 3 times in terms of quantitative results what has been, let's say, assumed at present in the World Energy Outlook in the latest edition, where a special offshore wind study has been conducted for Europe. So we are talking in the techno-friendly in our studies about 1,700 terawatt hours, and the World Energy Outlook about 600 to 700 as far as I know. And finally, we have here the gradual development. So this is the most conservative scenario, a little bit of each. Again, electricity generation on the left-hand side up to 2050. And in this scenario, we have less energy efficiency implementations. We have, let's say, have to cover higher energy demand and also electricity demand. And therefore, electricity generation not only doubles, but let's say, grows by the factor 2.5 or so. And on the right-hand side, we see again the emissions, and we still can emit up to 2050 because here we comply to the 2-degree target. Now, at the end, so 2 nice slides where we compare the key indicators of the different scenarios, and in the next slide, then also the CO2 prices for the developments for the different scenarios. On the left-hand side here, we see the installed electricity generation capacities and also the storage capacities for the different stories and scenarios. And what's interesting, for instance, the yellow color is the techno-friendly. This is the deployment of the new novel technologies where we benefit from the high utilization hours. And therefore we need, let's say, the smallest amount of installed capacities due to the high utilization hours. On the other hand, let's say in societal commitment, the blue one, so this is the local, decentralized approach of our energy system and electricity generation, with a lot of building integrated PV, and due to the low utilization hours, we need, of course, higher installed capacities, and also corresponding higher amounts then of storage capacities. So this is also seen in on the left hand side, the storage related part of the figure. So in blue we see the highest deployment of these capacities. And on the right hand side you see hydrogen production and usage per scenario. So hydrogen starts to take off in 2035, and then the years later up to 2050. And in almost all cases, but also, for instance, so for gradual development, or also the societal commitment scenario, so we heavily rely, or the model heavily relies beyond 2040 on hydrogen production, because this is a necessity finally to meet the remaining CO2 budget. So it's the algorithm simply, let's say, pushes the CO2 price, or the shadow price is going up, and to reach the trade-off criterion that finally hydrogen comes competitive. So this is very important, this indicator for us, to see so at what price levels let's say large-scale hydrogen rollout can become competitive and actually will be delivered to finally comply to the remaining CO2 budgets we have. And here we see the corresponding CO2 prices for the development until 2050. And maybe for us scientists or modelers, it's not surprising. So we are rather relaxed if we see these kind of numbers. But if you talk to policymakers, politicians, or even people to the industry, that let's say we might end up in 700, 800, 900 euros per ton CO2 in 2050, maybe people could get scared. Or if you already talk about, let's say, 200-300 euros per ton CO2 in 2030 or so, or what we see here, for instance, in the directed transition. So this is simply the shadow price of our optimization exercise here, with the different, let's say, the linear fractions of remaining CO2 budgets up to 2050. So this is simply the necessity of our optimization model to show us, let's say, the trade-off criterion, that fossil technologies are kicked out and clean technologies come in. And this is, let's say, more or less the truth, what's needed, and the price signals in terms of CO2 prices we need to manage the phase out of the fossil technologies. And the directed transition is rather, let's say, a linear development, and in the other scenarios we rather rely on a rather slow development, so it will be a little bit postponed, but we see then in 2040 or so, for instance, for Technofriendly and the societal commitment. So it's simply, let's say, to comply with the remaining CO2 budget constraint, we simply, let's say, have to produce then mainly hydrogen on large scale and roll it out, and these CO2 price developments, they show us where hydrogen can become competitive. So this leads me already, let's say, to the conclusions or to the main findings. I will not, let's say, repeat the kind of results we already have seen. So what we have seen, so we have to work, we have our homework in Europe. In recent month and last year, we started with the EU Green Deal. At present, we have a comprehensive discussion. So the European Commission is, let's say, informing the public, the industry, the stakeholders. And so at present, you see that things are moving on, and we have to start right now. Because if we want to comply to this climate targets, we have to remove already 2/3 of our emissions within the next 10 to 15 years. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And we'll need most probably a strong policy steering, and therefore the directed transition scenario is supposed to be the most promising what we have seen, because the others, they are more risky, that we delay the process too long. And we have seen in the residential sector also the electrification towards heat pumps. We need in the transport sector, in the private sector, electric vehicles, or then in the industry, and of course in the freight transport, we need hydrogen. And what we also have seen that let's say removing the last third of the CO2 emissions, so in 2030, 35 to 2050, that this needs extremely high CO2 prices. But finally, it's not necessarily a problem, because those who are not affected by CO2 prices anymore, they simply do not care about these prices. But this is what are the needs. So, and finally, so I invite you, here you see the link to our open entrance scenario explorer. So everything can be found there, not only the data sets and the scenario, but also already the open source, open access tools. There, everything is for free. And also the Genesis mod energy system model can be used and further developed by third parties according to the individual needs. And this is, let's say, one of the products we want to deliver to remove also the barriers here for scientists in academia, but also students, PhD, master students, that they get faster, let's say, involved in this kind of energy system modeling. So finally, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd like also to acknowledge, let's say, the work of our team in the Open Entrance project. So here you see the link again, and you will there also see the partners involved. It's really an exciting project still going on, and it really is fun to work in this fantastic team, and hopefully will also be successful to get some kind of follow-up grant there. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward now to your interesting questions and the discussions we'll have right now. Thank you.